Thank you, Mr. President. I am looking forward to proceeding to the National Defense Authorization Bill soon. Earlier today, I objected to a consent request to get on the bill because I'm very concerned that I get an opportunity to offer an amendment that I have based on the efforts of our chairman and his confidence that I will be able to offer this amendment. I'm prepared to agree to allow us to get on the bill, and I look forward to doing that. I want to address two amendments that I am hopeful will be included, mine and one other. One of them has to do with the tariffs especially on steel and aluminum that come under Section 232 of our trade laws, and the other is an amendment that I intend to offer with respect to the CFIUS reform. So let me start with the Section 232 tariffs. This is a section of trade law that allows the president to restrict imported goods that threaten our national security. So it's been the law of the land for some time. The statute gives very wide latitude to the president and the Commerce Department, but really to the president, to determine, first of all, what imports constitute a threat to our national security. And then secondly, the legislation, existing law, does not prescribe what the remedy will be. That also is left up to the president. So a great deal of discretion that is in the hands of the president. Well, in March of this year, after a nearly year-long investigation, the president imposed tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum. Then there was a temporary exclusion. Then there were negotiations to make the temporary exclusions permanent, and in some cases that has occurred, like South Korea and other places, but they were negotiated, right? The exclusion, the ability of the countries to sell steel to the United States without the American consumers being subject to this tax had a condition, and the condition was that they would agree to other restrictions on their exports, like quotas, for instance, on the volume of their exports that would be permitted. And shockingly to some, the president decided to even impose these taxes on American consumers when they buy steel that originates in the EU, Canada, and Mexico, which originally had a temporary exclusion, but apparently no longer do. These three allies make up about, mind you, make up about 40% of U.S. steel imports by tonnage. And all three seemed intent on imposing retaliatory tariffs, which is what typically happens when tariffs are launched. And now, more recently, the president has announced that the Commerce Department will investigate whether foreign vehicles, automobiles, sold to the United States consumers, like my constituents, whether those cars and trucks represent a national security threat, with the possibility that they will impose 25% taxes on Americans who buy those imported cars and trucks. I think this is a very bad idea, Mr. President. This is a bad path to be going on. It is bad policy. First of all, most directly, it's a direct tax on American consumers. That's just irrefutable. Consumers, our constituents, will have to pay higher prices for the products that are subject to these taxes. The price of a Honda Civic made in Japan or a Volkswagen Jetta made in Germany will increase by about $5,000 for a U.S. or Pennsylvanian or Coloradan that wants to buy one of these vehicles. And of course, it's pretty clear to me that these taxes on American consumers will do nothing to safeguard our national security. I fail to see the national security threat when a Pennsylvanian decides to buy a Toyota Corolla. It's not clear to me how that is a threat to our national security. So, in fact, there is no real national security threat that these tariffs are a response to. They are an effort to impose a protectionist policy for economic purposes. And in picking steel, it's particularly disturbing that Section 232 would be invoked as the justification for taxes on steel imports. Section 232 is explicitly reserved for national security threats, as I mentioned. Well, let's think about this. Just last year, net steel imports accounted for about 25% of America's total steel consumption. So, in other words, domestically, we produce the large majority, like 75%, of all the steel that we need to consume. Now, our military, for national security purposes, they need about 3% of our domestic consumption. We produce 75%. How is it even plausible that there's a national security reason that we shouldn't be importing this steel? Well, what about where it's coming from? That's interesting. The biggest sources of imported steel are Canada and Mexico, where, by the way, we have trade surpluses in steel. And now, again, using the justification of national security, we've put tariffs, taxes that Americans have to pay when we buy steel from Canada and Mexico. Close allies, contiguous countries. I mean, to suggest that we have a national security need to tax Americans when they buy this small percentage of our total consumption from these close allies and neighbors, come on, it's not credible. It's not credible. In fact, for national security purposes, arguably, it undermines our national security because it raises the cost of the steel that our defensive needs, that we need to build the things we need. We would pay more for that steel. How is that good for America? So it's clear to me that the president is using Section 232 in a way that is not intended by Congress. It's clear to me anyway. And prior to this year, Section 232 was only invoked 5 times in all of its history. But now we have this being invoked on steel and aluminum and maybe automobiles as well. Here's the thing. It's Congress that has the responsibility for establishing tariffs, taxes, to regulate trade. It's explicit. The Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and I quote, "The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises." Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 includes Congress having the responsibility to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Well, obviously, this is an explicit instruction that it is Congress's responsibility to determine the level of tariffs and whether or not there will be. What Congress has done over the years, it has passed laws that delegate this authority to the president. Well, first of all, I think it's a bad idea for Congress to take constitutional authority that is enshrined in our founding document and just punt it over to another branch of our government. We shouldn't be doing that. We ought to be abiding by the Constitution, following the Constitution, and accepting the responsibility that the Constitution gives to us. So I have long felt that this is a responsibility that Congress should take back, that the prior legislation giving this authority to the president was a mistake. It's time to take it back. Well, Senator Corker, it's my understanding, is likely to offer an amendment that would do something that's very simple, and it's an elegant solution to this dilemma with respect to Section 232 tariffs, and that is to simply make them subject to congressional assent. It would no longer be allowable, permissible, under our law, if this amendment were to be passed and signed into law, for any president to unilaterally invoke Section 232 and impose taxes on the American people in response. There would be a period of time during which Congress would review and would have to have an expedited up or down vote, not subject to filibuster, not drawn out, but a quick up or down vote to determine whether or not that would be allowed. This, I would suggest, Mr. President, would be completely in keeping with our explicit constitutional responsibility in this very important area. So I am very hopeful and optimistic that Senator Corker will, in fact, offer his amendment. It will be allowed, and we will debate it, and we'll have a vote, and we'll see how that goes. I intend to offer a separate amendment, and my amendment has to do with CFIUS. CFIUS is an acronym that stands for the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. And what it does is this is an interagency committee, multiple agencies within the executive branch, review the national security implications of foreign direct investment. So when a company that is headquartered in another country wishes to make a purchase of an American company, if there is a national security implication or threat to that investment, which there could be, then under the existing CFIUS framework, this committee makes a recommendation to the president, and the president has the authority to block the transaction, to forbid the purchase of an American company, say, by a foreign company, if there's a perception that this is a threat to national security. Well, Senator Cornyn has introduced legislation that would update and modernize the authorities of CFIUS. It would dramatically broaden the power and the authority of CFIUS. And I am supportive of what Senator Cornyn wants to do here. I voted for his legislation in the Banking Committee. This reform of CFIUS has been put into the National Defense Authorization Bill, so if and when we get on that bill, we will also be contemplating this broadening of the powers of CFIUS. So how does it broaden, how does the Cornyn legislation broaden CFIUS? Well, first of all, it dramatically expands the transactions that can be reviewed by CFIUS. For instance, under current law, CFIUS has no legal authority to review if a foreign company chooses to buy real estate that is undeveloped, a raw piece of land somewhere that is not subject to CFIUS review. But what if an unfriendly government has an investment in a company in their country that wants to buy a big tract of land right next to a sensitive military installation of the United States? That might be a convenient place for them to set up listening devices and other ways for them to spy on our military capabilities, for instance. So I think it's a good idea to give CFIUS the authority to look at real estate transactions. It would also expand CFIUS's authority to look at non-passive investment in critical technology or infrastructure by any foreign person. It would review any change in foreign investors' rights regarding a U.S. business, and there are many other new categories of transactions. So CFIUS historically, roughly speaking, I think they review something on the order of 200 or 250 transactions per year under existing law. If this new reform is adopted, then the experts believe that CFIUS will likely review something on the order of 2,000 or 2,500 transactions per year. So it's a very, very broad expansion in the power of the government to block foreign direct investment into the United States. We should be clear about one aspect of this. The reforms to CFIUS is largely a response to very aggressive and, in many cases, inappropriate behavior by Chinese companies. Companies that are headquartered in China, very, very often there is some Chinese government ownership, and there is a long history of the Chinese, through these vehicles, engaging in wholly inappropriate activity, including coerced technology transfer on the part of U.S. companies through a variety of means. This is a real problem, and expanding the authority of CFIUS is an important element, in my view, in dealing with this problem. So this is part of the reason why, this is the main reason why I'm in favor of expanding the powers of CFIUS. But it's also really important that we not, in the process, that we not unduly undermine foreign direct investment in the United States that is not a threat to our national security at all. And in fact, that's the vast majority of foreign direct investment in the United States. When Toyota decides to build a new manufacturing facility to make cars in Tennessee, that is not a threat to America's national security. If they were to make an investment with a car company in the United States and establish a joint venture and start making cars in Michigan, this would not be a threat to national security. The vast majority of transactions are not at all a threat. And in fact, they're a source of important jobs. In my state of Pennsylvania, there are 334,000 Pennsylvanians who work for foreign-based companies that have invested in and operate and create jobs in Pennsylvania. 186,000 of those jobs are in manufacturing. And consider this, in 2015, the total amount of foreign direct investment in the U.S., so the total amount of money invested by people and companies who are somewhere other than America, but they choose to invest in America, total amount was almost $500 billion, $465 billion. You know how much of that came from China? Less than 6 out of almost 500 billion. So it's a very, very small percentage. In 2016, the numbers were comparable, about 460 billion in total foreign direct investment, about 10 of that from China. China's not even close to being in the top 10 countries that are the source of foreign direct investment into the United States. Now, that doesn't mean it's unimportant to consider when Chinese companies are making investments. It's very important. But my point is, the vast majority of the foreign direct investment into our country is good for our economy. It creates jobs and opportunities, and we don't want to disrupt that. If the implementation of this reform to CFIUS goes badly, it could have a chilling effect on foreign direct investment, and that would diminish our economic growth, our economic strength, and cost us who knows how many jobs. And that's what I want to make sure we avoid. In the course of the implementation, the way this is going to happen under the law is the reformed CFIUS, the legislation that we're going to consider as part of NDAA. It requires this committee, this CFIUS committee, to develop the rules that will basically define the terms of their own operations. So, for instance, they'll have very, very broad discretion. If their discretion is too broad, not just say that, if they exercise it too broadly, if they end up with applying CFIUS restrictions too broadly, we will lose the foreign direct investment that is good for us. If they define it too narrowly, then it's a chance we won't catch bad actors that we should catch. Let me give you a few examples of how the rulemaking is going to determine how CFIUS applies. One of the key terms throughout the legislation is critical infrastructure and technology companies, right? Those are the companies with technologies that we don't necessarily want to end up in the hands of an adversarial country like China. Well, guess who defines what is a critical infrastructure and technology company? CFIUS does. We don't here in the Senate, Congress doesn't. We empower the committee, CFIUS, to decide what constitutes a critical infrastructure and technology company. We also empower CFIUS to decide when a company is attempting to circumvent the rules. Now, that's an important issue because following the rules strictly so as not to be caught up in this could be deemed to be a circumvention. And so that's an important factor. There are lots of other rulemakings that we require of this committee, and it is the way they make those rules which will determine exactly the extent to which we continue to foster constructive foreign direct investment or we choke it off. My concern, Mr. President, is that Congress should not simply blindly hand this off to the executive branch and hope for the best. That would not be fulfilling our obligation to enact the legislation as it should be enacted. So I intend to file an amendment, and my amendment is very simple. It's just going to provide Congress with the opportunity and the requirement to review the major rulemakings, the big parts, the important parts of defining the terms and circumstances under which CFIUS will operate before they can go into effect. So CFIUS will go ahead, promulgate these rules, and before they become operative, there has to be an up or down vote by Congress. We've written this so that there will be an expedited procedure. It'll pass with a simple majority. There has to be a vote. The vote actually has to happen in almost the exact same time frame that for the rules implementation. In other words, after a rulemaking is finished, there's a 60-day delay before it becomes operative. It is during that window when Congress would have its vote, and it could not be filibustered, it could not be delayed. But what it would do, would ensure that we're involved in this process, we have the oversight we're supposed to exercise to make sure it is done properly, and that we would work with the administration. Now, if Congress would reject one or more of these rules, that doesn't stop the administration. They would then work with us to address whatever concerns led to the objection and then submit a new rule. It is modeled somewhat after the REINS Act that is very, very broadly supported on this side of the aisle, but I should point out it's much, much more limited because this congressional review of the rulemaking under my amendment applies only to the rules made by CFIUS under this legislation. So it's a very, very narrow application. There were 39 Republican co-sponsors of the REINS Act. If that were the law of the land, if that had been adopted, we wouldn't be having this discussion because it would automatically apply to the rulemaking of CFIUS. So it's hard to see why anyone who supports the REINS Act would oppose this. But I'm certainly hoping that my Democratic colleagues will support this as well. Let's be honest. They have not been big fans of the Trump administration. Many of them have voted against the cabinet and agency leaders that President Trump has nominated who will be responsible for carrying out these rules. For them to vote no on this amendment would be for them to insist that they not have the opportunity to review the work of the Trump administration. Given their obvious and vocal skepticism about the Trump administration, why in the world would they refuse the opportunity to have veto power over a really important rulemaking? I can't imagine why they would. So I hope they will support this, as I hope my Republican colleagues will as well. Another important point, just to reiterate, the congressional approval applies only to the rulemaking of CFIUS when it is done. It certainly does not apply to the individual transactions that would subsequently be reviewed by CFIUS under these rules, just to the rules themselves. And it certainly would not result in killing CFIUS reform. I mean, Congress has demonstrated a very broad bipartisan consensus that we need to broaden the authority of CFIUS. So I'm quite confident that when these rules are done, if they're done in a sensible fashion, Congress is going to agree to them because Congress wants CFIUS to have this new authority. I will point out it would almost certainly have the effect of encouraging the administration to work closely with Congress to make sure that they are in fact developing rules that are consistent with congressional intent, and that's exactly the way it should work. So, Mr. President, if this amendment passes, I foresee greater collaboration between the administration and Congress on the implementation of this CFIUS reform. I think that will likely lead to a better product, one that ensures that we will catch the bad actors who are trying to make investments in the U.S. for the purpose of acquiring technology we don't want them to have, and allow for the good, constructive, helpful foreign direct investment that we all benefit from. So my hope is we'll get on this defense authorization bill soon, that these and many other amendments will be debated and voted on, and we'll be able to pass this with a very strong affirmative vote. With that, I yield the floor.